The rotary telephone sat on the corner of the kitchen counter, right where it had lived since the winter of 1978. It was a heavy, avocado-green Western Electric model, bolted to the wall. Its coiled cord had once stretched all the way to the pantry, back when voices in this house were loud and constant. Now, the cord hung in a perfectly tight, undisturbed spiral, free of the kinks that decades of impatient teenage fingers used to leave in it. It was clean, dusted every Thursday morning with an old cotton undershirt, looking exactly as it did when the world was entirely different. I sat at the Formica kitchen table, my right hand lightly cupping a ceramic mug of Maxwell House coffee. I didn't drink it. I simply watched the small skin form across the surface of the dark liquid, a sure sign that the heat was escaping. The steam had stopped rising 5 minutes ago. Earlier, I had walked down the gravel driveway to check the mailbox at the edge of the county road. The hinges of the aluminum box had creaked with a sharp, familiar metal whine, but today the sound seemed swallowed by the heavy autumn afternoon. Inside, I had found 3 identical glossy flyers from a local real estate agent, a coupon book for a grocery store 2 towns over, and the monthly electric bill. No letters, no handwritten return addresses. I laid the mail on the counter beside the green phone without opening any of it, letting the advertisements face down against the laminate. To pass the time, I opened the morning paper, turning the thin, gray pages with a slow rustle. I tried to focus on the town council's debate over the new traffic light on Elm Street, but the words refused to stick. My eyes kept slipping off the print, drifting toward the small window above the sink where the afternoon light was changing from yellow to a deep amber. The house was filled with the low hum of a Tuesday afternoon. The old Kenmore refrigerator gave a sudden, shuddering sigh as its compressor kicked on, vibrating the linoleum floor. Once that sound became familiar, the grandfather clock in the hallway took over, its heavy brass pendulum slicing through the silence with an unyielding tick-tock. Martha had insisted on buying it for our 25th anniversary. Back then, the ticking was lost beneath the static of the television, the clatter of dinner pots, and the heavy thud of work boots hitting the floorboards. Today, the clock sounded like a giant metronome measuring out the emptiness of the room. Through the window, the backyard looked immaculate. The grass was trimmed, the oak trees were shedding their rusty leaves, and the aluminum lawn chairs sat in a perfect row near the garden bed, catching the long, slanting rays of the October sun. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Everything was peaceful. Yet, I found my gaze pulling back toward the kitchen counter, landing once again on the avocado-green telephone. I wasn't expecting a call. I knew the pharmacy wouldn't have my prescription ready until Friday, and my son, Greg, usually called from Chicago on the first Sunday of every month, provided the kids didn't have a soccer tournament. There was no urgent news waiting across the wires. The realization came without any grand drama, arriving as softly as the shadows lengthening across the linoleum. I didn't miss the noise of a ringing phone. I missed the possibility of it. I looked at the heavy receiver and realized it had been months since anyone had dialed my number because they needed something from me right that second. No one was calling to ask where the jumper cables were kept. No one was calling to find out if I could stop by the hardware store to pick up a box of drywall screws. The world outside had sorted itself into a rhythm that no longer required my coordination. The house remained perfectly still. The green telephone stayed silent on its hook, giving off no vibration. The afternoon simply continued its slow, beautiful exit from the kitchen, leaving me alone with a cup of cold coffee and a house that had nothing left to say. I reached past the cold coffee and picked up the small, leather-bound address book that had spent the last 30 years tucked behind the recipe box. Its cover was made of a cheap split cowhide that had long since softened into something resembling velvet. The gold-embossed letters spelling telephone on the front completely rubbed away by the friction of searching thumb. I opened it on the table, the old paper giving off a faint smell of vanilla and cellar damp. The pages were a crowded graveyard of ink. I ran a wrinkled finger down the B section, stopping at Bates, Miller & Sons Construction. Below, it was a 7-digit number written in a hurried, heavy blue ballpoint ink that had begun to bleed into the fibers of the paper over 40 years ago. That was Miller's old shop down by the rail spur. Next to it was Crandall, Sarah, babysitter, followed by 3 different numbers crossed out with thick black lines as she moved from her parents' house to a college dorm and finally to an apartment in Peoria. Every page was thick with names that had once been the structural pillars of my daily life. There were the school principals, the little league coaches, the mechanics who knew exactly which trick would start the old station wagon on a freezing January morning, and the men from the church maintenance committee who used to call at midnight when the basement boiler began to rattle like a cage of wild animals. As I turned to the M section, my eyes lingered on a note written in the margin. Call Tom before 6 a.m. for carpool. A sudden rush of memory filled the quiet kitchen, so vivid that I could almost smell the sharp, metallic tang of cold winter air and diesel exhaust. I remembered the 1980s with a clarity that made my chest ache. In those years, the kitchen counter was the absolute nerve center of a small, chaotic empire. The avocado-green phone didn't just ring, it demanded, it screamed, it rattled against the wall. I remembered standing exactly where I was standing now, holding the receiver between my shoulder and my ear while trying to scrape dried oatmeal off a pot in the sink. Martha would be shouting over the roar of the vacuum cleaner, asking if that was the school calling about Greg's scraped knee. The hallway would be an obstacle course of nylon backpacks, muddy Converse sneakers, and hockey sticks that always seemed to fall over the moment someone shut the front door. Arthur, tell them we can bring the orange slices for the Saturday game. Martha would yell from the living room, her hair tied back in a bandana, her hands full of laundry. And then there were the weekends. God, the weekends were exhausting. I remembered the relentless, beautiful fatigue of those Saturdays. The phone would ring at 7 in the morning. Always Tom or Gary wanted to know if I had a spare pipe wrench or if I wanted to split a load of gravel from the quarry. By 9, I would be standing in the bright, fluorescent glare of the local Home Depot, surrounded by the smell of freshly cut cedar and fertilizer, arguing about the difference between brass and galvanized fittings. My hands back then were always stained with grease or covered in small, stinging cuts from wire mesh. I spent hours under the porch fixing a rotted joist, or in the driveway turning a small screw on the carburetor of a red Schwinn bicycle so my daughter wouldn't miss the neighborhood block party. The kitchen table back then was never clear. It was buried under permission slips, bank statements, half-eaten pieces of toast, and blueprints for a tool shed I never quite found the time to finish. I had spent 20 years complaining about how tired I was. I had spent 20 years wishing for just one weekend where nobody asked me for a favor, nobody broke a window with a baseball, and nobody needed me to fix a leaky faucet. I looked down at my hands now. They were clean. The nails were trimmed and white, free of the black engine oil that used to take days to scrub out of the cuticles. There were no projects waiting in the garage. The tools were oiled and hanging in their proper outlines on the pegboard, completely undisturbed. I had gotten exactly what I wished for during those long, exhausting summer nights. Perfect, uninterrupted peace. I looked back at the open address book on the Formica table. The ink didn't move, but as I stared at the names of men who had passed away while Eisenhower or Reagan were in office, names of women who had moved to Florida and faded into Christmas card signatures, names of friends whose voices I could no longer recall. The kitchen didn't feel quite so empty anymore. For a brief, flickering moment, the ghost of a crowded, noisy life seemed to occupy the stools around the island. The ghosts of children long grown and gone seemed to be slamming the screen door just out of sight, leaving me with a strange, bittersweet realization that I would give every single dollar left in my bank account to have just one more exhausting, chaotic Saturday.
This is exactly what we needed.
I'll second that. Cheers,
By 8
everyone.
o'clock that evening, the autumn air had turned sharp, carrying the first real hint of the coming winter. I moved into the living room, where the only illumination came from a single brass floor lamp next to my armchair. The rest of the room sat in a soft, velvet shadow. On my lap rested the heavy, black-bound family photo album, its cardboard covers thick and stiff against my old trousers. I lifted the cover, the plastic sleeves inside sticking together with a small, static click before parting. The first page was a black and white photograph of my parents standing in front of their first home in Ohio, their faces serious and unblinking as they stared into the lens of an old box camera. My father was wearing a high-waisted suit that looked too large for him. My mother had her hair set in perfect, tight waves. I turned the page. The photographs transitioned into the bright, slightly unstable dyes of Kodak color film from the 60s and 70s. There was Martha on our wedding day, standing on the steps of the Methodist church, her veil caught in a sudden gust of wind that made her laugh. A real, unposed laugh that showed the small gap between her front teeth that she always hated in pictures. There was I myself, 30 pounds lighter, standing next to my best man, Frank, both of us holding cans of Schlitz beer and looking like we owned the entire county. Further in, the pages became a chronicle of family vacations to the Great Smokies, backyard barbecues where the smoke from the charcoal grill always seemed to blow directly into the camera, and christenings where infants were wrapped in lace gowns that had since turned yellow in a cedar chest upstairs. I traced my fingers over Frank's face in the barbecue photo. Frank had been the assistant manager at the lumber yard. We had spent 30 years talking across fences, sharing lawnmowers, and complaining about the local school board. Frank had died of a stroke 3 years ago in a hospital room in Scottsdale. The popular myth about getting old, I realized as I stared into the glossy paper, was that your mind failed you. People always worried about losing their memories, about the names fading away like old ink, about wandering into a room and forgetting why they had crossed the threshold. But that wasn't the real cruelty of the years. My memory was sharp. I could still remember the exact cost of the shingles I bought for the garage roof in 1982. I could still remember the smell of Martha's skin when she came in from the garden, a mix of tomato leaves and sunscreen. The real terror of old age was that your memory remained perfectly intact, while the world around you ran out of witnesses. I looked at the photo of my 35th birthday party in the basement recreation room. There were 8 people crammed onto the vinyl sofa, all of them raising their glasses toward the photographer. As I counted them from left to right, a cold weight settled in my chest. Gary was gone. Gary's wife, Joan, was in a nursing facility in Indiana and didn't recognize her own daughters. Linda had passed from cancer before she turned 50. Frank was in Arizona. Martha had been gone 4 years this coming November. Of the 8 people who had laughed until their stomachs hurt when the birthday cake fell off the cardboard stand that night, I was the only one left who remembered the sound of the laughter. If I were to tell my son Greg about that night, Greg would smile and say, "That sounds nice, Dad." But Greg wouldn't know. He wouldn't remember the specific smell of the cheap cigar smoke that filled the joists, or the way the record player skipped every time someone walked too heavily near the stereo cabinet. When an old man loses his friends, he doesn't just lose companionship, he loses his evidence. He becomes like a traveler who has visited a beautiful, distant island that has since sunk beneath the ocean waves. He can describe the trees, the color of the water, and the songs of the birds to the people on the mainland, but to them, it is just a story. There is no one else to stand beside him, nod their head, and say, "Yes, I was there too." It was exactly like that. The album felt heavier now, its thick pages pressing down against my thighs like a concrete block. The people inside the plastic sleeves remained frozen in their moments of perpetual youth and health, their smiles never fading, their eyes forever looking toward a future that had already happened and cleared away. I slowly brought the heavy black cover down, shutting the book with a soft, muffled thud that seemed to signal the finality of the evening. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pick up my book. I simply sat in the deep green armchair, watching the small dust motes drift through the beam of the brass lamp, while the memories of 50 years ago remained in the room, huddled around me in the dark like old friends who had nowhere else to go. Perhaps the loneliest part of growing old isn't being alone. Perhaps it's realizing how few people remain who remember the roads you traveled to become the person sitting quietly in this room. The next evening, I carried a fresh mug of coffee out to the screened-in front porch. I didn't use my mug with the logo of the tool company anymore. I had picked one of Martha's old blue and white stoneware cups, the one she had bought at a craft fair in Ohio, because she liked the weight of the clay in her hands. I placed it carefully on the small wicker table beside my glider chair and sat down, my old joints giving a brief, familiar pop as I settled back against the canvas cushions. The sun was dropping below the tree line at the edge of the property, painting the Kansas sky in long, horizontal bands of bruised purple, dusty pink, and a deep, cold indigo. The air was perfectly still. Across the blacktop road, the neighbor's cornfield had already been harvested, leaving nothing but rows of dry, pale yellow stalks that looked like broken teeth against the dark soil. I didn't bring a radio out with me. I didn't bring a newspaper. Years ago, I would have felt a strange, twitching anxiety at the thought of just sitting still for an hour without some kind of task before me, a lawn to edge, a gutter to clean, a bill to calculate. I would have felt like I was wasting my life away. Now, I understood that time wasn't something you could save up or use efficiently. It was simply something you sat inside while it passed. As the last light faded from the sky, the automatic street lamp at the corner of my driveway hummed to life, casting a pale, lavender-gray circle over the gravel. A few moments later, the crickets in the tall grass near the drainage ditch began their evening song, a slow, rhythmic chirping that seemed to rise out of the earth itself as the temperature dropped. From inside the house, through the screen door, the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock carried out into the cool night air, joining the crickets in a strange, slow duet that marked the passage of another October day. I didn't try to find a solution to the silence. I didn't call an old acquaintance just to hear a voice, nor did I make plans to sell the house and move into an active adult community where there were scheduled bus trips to casinos and card games in the lounge. I knew those things were just modern ways of hiding from the inevitable shadow of the years. I wasn't interested in rediscovering myself, or starting a new hobby, or pretending that 82 was the new 50. I reached down and touched the side of the blue stoneware mug. The coffee had grown cold again, just as it had the day before and the day before that. I didn't mind. I didn't need the warmth to enjoy the evening. The silence of the house and the yard was no longer an intruder I had to fight off with a television set or a telephone conversation. It had become something substantial, something with a weight and a presence of its own, like an old dog that had come into the room and laid its heavy head across my slippers. It was just another part of the architecture now, as permanent as the avocado-green phone on the kitchen wall or the cedar trees guarding the driveway. I sat on the porch as the darkness became complete, my hands resting loose and open on the armrests of the glider. The world outside my screened-in room grew smaller and smaller until it consisted of nothing but the circle of light beneath the street lamp, the cool breath of the October wind against my forehead, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of the clock ticking away the minutes in the dark hall behind me. The porch glider swung an inch forward, then back, making no sound at all as the night deepened, and the image of the old man on the porch faded slowly into the quiet landscape of the American evening.